Okay. The title of the lecture is The Growing Power of the Presidency. And so we're going to be taking a look at how the office of the president, the executive branch, has grown and been shaped over time by the people who have served in it. Now, we're not going to talk about every single president, but we are going to hit some important milestones along the way. Okay? So before we get into people who have served as president, it would make sense, I think, to start out by looking at what the president's constitutional powers are. It's hard for us to really imagine it because we have always lived in a time where we have a powerful president. But early presidents didn't hold anywhere near as much power as modern presidents do. Right? In fact, our earliest presidents did little more than carry out the specific powers that the Constitution gave them. So, let's talk about that. So our earliest presidents, they're looking at the Constitution and they're saying, okay, it's my job just to do what the Constitution tells me I can do. So what are some of those powers? What are some things that the Constitution allows or gives the president the power to do? You guys probably already are aware of some of them. What are some constitutional powers that the president has?
Veto.
Okay, the veto power, right? So one thing the Constitution says is the president can approve or veto legislation, right? And we talked about that in more detail when we looked at the Constitution. That's one of those checks and balances. So he is given the power to approve or veto legislation. We're going to come back and talk about the veto power in a few minutes. What else can the president do according to the Constitution?
Appoint the justices.
Okay, he can appoint important officials. And Abby gave us a good example there, like Supreme Court justices. That may be his, and I will say his, and he and him, simply because historically every president has been a male. I'm not being sexist. Okay? We know that a female can serve as president, and probably won't be too terribly long before that happens. Whether or not that's 2016, I don't know. But I'm going to say him because all of them have been males so far. So the president appoints important officials. We typically think of him appointing, Supreme Court justices, but there's others too. Right? Ambassadors, for example, would be the president appoints ambassadors. The president appoints important advisors, so like his Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General. Those are presidential appointments. All right, can we think of any other things that the Constitution allows the president to do? What are his powers?
Isn't he able to control the army?
Okay, not just the army, but the entire armed forces. Right? The president is the commander-in-chief. And it's commander-in-chief, not and chief. Commander-in-chief of the military. Means he is in charge of our armed forces. Think of any others?
He
can send troops to go fight.
Right? That's because he's the commander-in-chief. Right? You're right that he can do that, but that's because of his power as commander-in-chief.
Up to 90 days, right? Because Senate needs to...
Yeah, that gets into a whole... We're going to look at that when we get to the War Powers Act in the spring. That has to do more with Vietnam and the way that Vietnam was handled. The president is also given the power to make treaties with foreign countries. The president is given the power to call Congress into what is called a special session. Which basically just means, he can force Congress to come back to work. For the most part, Congress sets its own schedule. Because sometimes they need to take breaks and go back to their home states. Talk to their constituents. You guys talked about that a little bit on Friday. But if everyone's home, the president has the power to force them back to Washington usually that's only going to be in a time of crisis or major, something major has to get done. The president is given the power to grant pardons to criminals. What is a pardon? What does that mean?
You aren't going, isn't it like if you're for the death penalty?
It could be the death penalty. It doesn't have to be the death penalty. You can pardon someone from a lesser crime, too.
Get out of jail free card.
Sort of, right? Pardon is the idea, it's forgiveness from punishment, right? So if somebody is convicted of a crime, the president can issue them a pardon and basically forgive them from that crime. So sometimes you see that with somebody who's on death row, the president might grant not really necessarily a pardon, but might commute their sentence or basically get them out of the death penalty. Doesn't mean they're necessarily let out of jail, okay? And, they're not going to use that all the time to let every criminal out of jail, okay? But a good example, perhaps the most famous example of a presidential pardon was Gerald Ford became president when Richard Nixon resigned because he had committed crimes. And while the FBI and other groups were investigating Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford issued a pardon. And he pardoned Nixon from the crimes that he was being investigated for. And he took a lot of flack for that. A lot of people said, hang on a minute here, right? Rule of law says no one's above the law. He committed a crime, he should be punished for it. And here you went and issued him a pardon. And a lot of historians, I think, argue that that was a major factor in Gerald Ford not being elected the next time around. So that is a power that the president has. A very important one that the Constitution, and kind of a vague one that the Constitution gives, is the power to, and here's what it says, faithfully execute the laws of the land. Faithfully execute the laws of the land. And that's where we get the term executive branch, right? Because he executes the laws, he carries them out. And that's very vague. The Constitution doesn't tell the president how to do that. It just says, carry out the laws, right? So, obviously, our earliest presidents are going to have to kind of figure this out, right? What does this mean? What does it look like? How do I do this? So, in our sort of journey through the growth of presidential power, we're going to logically start with George Washington, our first president. I need to not use blue. This is hard to get off the board here. So we know from our look at the Constitution that one of the real concerns that Americans had in the early years of our country was a government that was too powerful. We wanted to make sure that we didn't have another king. So when Washington takes over as president, he has to kind of find a nice balance between being powerful but not being too powerful. Right? He doesn't want to seem like a king. Okay. I'll read you a quote. This is in the textbook, but I'll read it out, and you don't have to write this down. But it's interesting. It sort of gives us a view into Washington's mindset of how he was approaching his position. He said, "I walk on untrodden ground." What does that mean? The ground is untrodden.
Isn't it nobody's ever explored?
No one's ever walked it. Right? I'm walking on a totally new path here that no one's ever walked before. It says, "I walk on untrodden ground. There's scarcely any part of my conduct which may not hereafter be drawn into precedent." And that's an important word. And it's kind of confusing because it sounds like president, but it's not. Precedent. As the first president, everything that Washington did set an example for others to follow. And that's what the word precedent means. It's an example to be followed. So Washington says, no one's ever done this before. I'm going to have to kind of figure everything out. And every single thing that I do is going to be a model for every president that comes after me. So Washington sets the stage. Can you guys think of any precedents that Washington set that other presidents that have followed have tried to stick to?
2 terms in office.
2 terms, very good. So 2 terms in office was an example of a precedent that Washington set. He said, after 2 terms, I'm done. I'm going to step down. Somebody else needs to take over and be president. And every president after him stuck to that. They said, hey, Washington said 8 years was enough. I'm gonna step down after 8 years. Now, some people didn't win re-election or they chose not to run again. They only did 1 term. But every president followed that up till Franklin Roosevelt. He was actually elected 4 times. And then we changed the Constitution so that couldn't happen anymore. We said, no. Washington said 2. That's a pretty good example to follow. So now the Constitution actually says you only get 2. All right, good. Think of any other things that Washington might have set an example for?
You say, like, try to stay out of other people's business. Like, don't try to go start wars.
He did say that, but he said that basically on his way out the door. That was like his farewell address. And then we totally ignored that part. Because pretty shortly thereafter, we're sticking our nose in everybody else's business. If the president were to walk through the door right now, we would all stand up and we would say, oh, good afternoon, Mr. President. So even the title, right, the title of Mr. President was a precedent that Washington set. There was actually debate in Congress about what should we call the president? By what title should we call him? Should it be His Majesty the President? Should it be His Excellency the President? And Washington said, nope, forget all of that. I'm not going to go with these very royal-sounding titles. Mr. President will do. Every president since then has been Mr. President. Washington also sets the example of having a cabinet of advisors. He very much understood this was a big job and he needed help. So he got together a group of advisors to help him run the executive branch. And those top advisors make up the president's cabinet. Every president since has had a cabinet. Not required, you don't have to, but every president's done it because Washington did it and it was a good idea. Washington also, very importantly, established that the president would use force if necessary to enforce the laws. Think back a couple of units ago when we were studying the Constitution. Prior to the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation. And it failed. It was a disaster because the national government wasn't strong enough. Right? Congress could pass a law, but there was no way to enforce it, so states could ignore it. And we ran into problems because we had things like Shays' Rebellion up in Massachusetts, where the national government was too weak to step in and say, knock it off. So Washington actually gets tested in his presidency when it comes to enforcing the laws. Okay? There was a law that dealt with whiskey. Right? People were making whiskey, and they were supposed to be paying taxes on it. And some of these farmers and other folks who were making whiskey in Pennsylvania said, we don't want to do that. We don't want to pay taxes on it. We're not going to. And we will resist attempts to make us pay it. And this got historically the nickname, or just the name, the Whiskey Rebellion. But it wasn't much of a rebellion. Because unlike Shays' Rebellion, now the national government can enforce the laws. And Washington proved willing to use force. So Washington shows up in Pennsylvania with the army and says, what was this whole thing about not wanting to follow the laws? And very wisely, these people out in Pennsylvania said, oh, just kidding, we'll pay the taxes. Don't shoot us. By doing this, what does Washington show about the presidency? How does he make the presidency look, the office of the presidency? Powerful, strong, respected. Right? It's like, this ain't the Articles of Confederation. You can't get away with that anymore. You're going to follow the laws, and if you don't, the executive branch is going to show up. Now, even today, right, I mean, we still do this. We don't like roll out the army anytime somebody breaks a law. But we do have the FBI. We have other law enforcement mechanisms designed to enforce the laws. Okay? If you break the laws, you go to jail. That's the executive branch right there. So Washington, not only important as the first, but important because he really sets the stage. Okay? Now, Washington and the presidents that followed, as I said, they pretty much would stick to what the Constitution said. Here's the powers I have, and I'll pretty much just stick to these powers. Over time, that's going to change. And the president will be doing more. The executive branch will be bigger. And the president will be a much more powerful position. So the next president we're going to kind of zoom in on as we journey through the executive branch is actually the nation's 7th president, Andrew Jackson. So look at how Jackson changes the presidency. By the late 1820s, the president became more and more a representative of the people, because more and more people were able to vote. I'll say that again. By the 1820s, when Jackson becomes president, the president has become more and more a representative of the American people, because more and more people were able to vote.
Can you repeat that one?
By the 1820s, the president became more and more a representative of the people, because more and more people were allowed to vote. Early on, it's primarily the wealthy, right? The landowners, small percentage of people choosing who the president's going to be. By the 1820s, it's more of your commoner, your average American, the farmer, the laborer, the dock worker. And so the president was seen not so much as a representative of the wealthy, but a representative of all Americans. And by all Americans, of course, I mean white men, because other groups were still excluded. Okay? And arguably, no president has really embodied that common man image more so than Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson came from a very poor background, and he rose up to become rather wealthy and very powerful. Ends up becoming the president. So he was sort of seen as, you know, the protector, the defender of the common man. And because he saw himself as the protector of the common man, Jackson becomes the first president to widely use the veto. Now, he's not the first to use it. Other presidents used it. They just didn't use it very much. Earlier presidents would pretty much only use the veto if they felt a law was unconstitutional. Jackson saw himself as the defender of the common man, so he would use the veto to block any laws that he just didn't like, or that he felt were bad for the average American, the common man. A good example of that, and you don't have to write this down, but a good example was the fight over what was called the Bank of the United States. There's this whole battle over whether the Bank of the United States should be renewed. Right? It had a charter, the charter was up. Congress passed a renewal saying we want to keep the bank going, and President Jackson vetoed it. Not because it was unconstitutional, but because he thought it was bad. He felt it was just designed to help the wealthy, and he said it was bad for the average American, so he blocked it. Right? And ever since Andrew Jackson, we've pretty much accepted the wide use of the veto power. So he marks an important step in the growth of presidential power, because from that point forward, presidents have widely used the veto. The next president we're going to talk about is Abraham Lincoln. Obviously an important president for many, many reasons. But Lincoln also adds to this growth of presidential power. Lincoln takes over a time of civil war. And so we needed a strong leader, a powerful leader in the White House, and Lincoln proved to be such a leader. Because we needed someone to really take charge during this period, Lincoln really expanded what it meant to faithfully execute the laws of the land.
Can you repeat that?
Because we needed a strong leader during this period of war, civil war. We needed a strong leader in the White House who could step up and take charge. He was able to really expand what it meant to faithfully execute the laws of the land. Lincoln took many steps, many actions while president without waiting for Congress's approval. Some examples. Lincoln declared martial law in parts of Maryland. Basically means, okay, the military is going to run Maryland. I know you guys have a government and everything, but we're going to stop that and the military is in charge. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. Which basically allowed the government to lock people up and keep them locked up without having to give them a trial in a set amount of time. So he suspended people's due process rights. The Supreme Court actually came back and said, sorry, Mr. President, that's unconstitutional. You can't do it. And Lincoln said, I don't really care. I'm doing it anyway. Because we are in a major crisis right now, and we've got to, these are some steps we have to take. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which took the step of freeing the slaves in the South. All of these things he did on his own. He didn't ask for Congress's approval. He didn't wait for Congress to act. He just did it. He said, this is part of my executive power, and I'm going to do it. And Lincoln showed, in doing these things, that the president's powers can be greatly expanded during emergencies or a crisis. We get two more presidents to talk about before we wrap up. And they're both named Roosevelt. The first one was Teddy Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt shaped the office of the president in a couple of ways. One, he was the first president to really use his position to try to influence public opinion on important issues. And he did this by holding daily press briefings. One of the ways that he would try to shape public opinion on important issues, rather than waiting for Congress to do something and then signing the bill or not, he would go ahead and just try to shape people's opinions to match his own. One thing that he would do was have a daily press briefing where reporters could come and ask him questions. So people started to want to know, well, what does the president think about this? And he used his position to try to convince people that his opinions were right and that they should go along with him. Now, the president gives press briefings every day, right? This starts with Roosevelt. Roosevelt would also go around and give speeches all around the country on important issues. And he allowed photographers to document life in the White House. They would take pictures of him working and playing. So people became more and more interested in what the president felt, what he thought. So that's one way Teddy Roosevelt shapes it. He turns the president into really an opinion shaper rather than somebody who just reacts. The second way that Teddy Roosevelt increases the power of the president is by growing the executive branch. Roosevelt created a bunch of new government agencies to carry out the laws. And that, think about things, agencies like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. These are new agencies that will help the president to protect the public, to make sure our food is safe, to keep the environment clean. So this makes the executive branch bigger.
Seems like since the executive branch's powers are limited, they've already had to figure out a way to kind of get around that.
Well, that's kind of the trajectory.
And in order to do that, it seems like they made the office larger than the other two offices by saying, okay, this is part of it, this is part of it, and this is part of it. And it, in some sense, kind of balanced it with the other two.
You can certainly say that. Some people, I think we'll talk about in a minute, some people think it's gone too far and it's gotten too big. But certainly it has grown. That's kind of the whole point here, is that it's very much grown over time. The other Roosevelt we're going to talk about as well, the other Roosevelt president, Franklin. Franklin Roosevelt was Teddy Roosevelt's cousin. Right? They weren't brothers, not father and son, they were cousins. And FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, built on Teddy's example and sort of turned the presidency into what we know it as today. Sort of the modern president. Franklin Roosevelt expanded the president's emergency powers in order to deal with the Great Depression and World War II. He was really the first president to practice sending bills to Congress rather than waiting for Congress to send bills to him. He would say, look, here's some things that need to happen to fix the Great Depression. I'm going to give you a bill. Now you pass it and send it back to me and I'll sign it. That was a drastic change. It kind of blurs the line between Congress and the president, right? Instead of sitting back and waiting for Congress to come up with new laws, he's saying, look, here's a good law that I think we should have. Why don't you guys go ahead and pass it? And then I'll sign it. And we've kind of gotten used to that. In fact, the Affordable Care Act, right, that's in effect today, it's called the Affordable Care Act. Congress wrote and passed the Affordable Care Act, but we call it Obamacare because it was really shaped by the president. That goes back to Roosevelt saying, hey, here's a good idea, now you pass it and send it back to me. Franklin Roosevelt really expanded the size and power of the national government. And he even got the people to go along with it through basically treating the people like they were just part of a conversation, what he called fireside chats. So he wins popular approval. He says radio addresses, people would sit down in their homes, turn on the radio, and it would almost feel like the president was just sitting right there with you, having a chat. It wasn't some big, powerful person way away in Washington. It was like he was right there in your home, just telling you, hey, here's this new program I want Congress to pass. Here's why we need it. Here's what it's going to do. Please write your congressman and urge them to support this important program. The president still does the same things today, right? They go around trying to win support for what they want the country to do. So this leads us to our last, and we're going to wrap up with this conversation about the imperial presidency. There's little doubt, in my mind at least, others may argue with me, but I think there's little doubt that the modern president today, right, I don't mean specifically Barack Obama, I mean just the president of the United States, has more power than our founding fathers could have ever imagined. Far more powerful than our founding fathers could have ever imagined. And so that has led to a debate about whether or not the president and the presidency has become the imperial presidency. So the word imperial, when I think about Star Wars, right? Imperial, empire, emperor, you got the imperial stormtroopers. Okay? The imperial presidency. On the one side, you have some people who argue, this is a bad thing. They say the president has become more like an emperor or a king than a president. He's gotten too powerful.
Would that be T with two O's?
T-O-O. Too powerful. That's the one-sided argument. The president's too powerful. Shouldn't have as much power. It's gotten out of whack. The flip side of the argument, the other side, you have some people who argue that a more powerful president's a good thing because then the president can do more good for the country. Right? A powerful president can do more good for the country. And they also point out that the president's power is still limited. There are still checks and balances. Right? He doesn't have unlimited power. There's still ways to keep the president in line. And that's a debate we haven't settled. Hint, 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 I just might be asking you about it.